Thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm Chris Bianchi, and today we're joined by the University of Colorado Denver political science expert and professor, Christophe Stefes, who joins us for a look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what we can expect from it moving forward. Professor Stefes specializes regionally in European affairs and autocratic regimes. And Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we had you on about a month ago, right after the war started, but we appreciate having your expertise once again here today.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
And of course, I want to start things off, of course, about a month ago, a little over a month ago, back on February the 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. And again, before we get into more of the nitty-gritty questions about this, we're now slightly over a month into this conflict. And where do we stand overall? What is the kind of broad picture about this conflict?
Yeah, a month ago or so, I predicted that this war would be over relatively soon. I was obviously wrong. It's dragging on. It has to do with both the weakness of the Russian military, which seems to be badly organized. It has to do with the resistance that the Ukrainians put up. The military seems to be doing the right things, going after the transportation lines, so tanks, Russian tanks without fuel, Russian soldiers without food. That all is certainly not a good thing for the Russians. On the other hand, we shouldn't be too optimistic that the Ukrainians can actually win this war in the long run. It seems that Putin is determined to throw a lot of resources behind this war. And there are still a lot of people that can be conscripted, young men in Russia that can be still conscripted. And I'm not hopeful that this war is going to end anytime soon.
With that in mind, it seems that the biggest development this week is that Russia appears to be shifting its focus in the war towards the Donbass region in the east of the country and perhaps away from the capital of Kyiv, although there's been some conflicting reports about whether or not the Russians are actually doing that. What does that shift mean, and what does that mean perhaps for the war moving forward?
Yeah, and I think the problem here is really, what do the Russians really want? And we are still not really sure what they want. Ideally, they would like to compromise over neutrality status in Ukraine, or they might want, Ukrainian recognition of Crimea belonging to Russia. We don't know that. So when they say they're shifting their emphasis towards the east, it seems to be that they are willing to compromise. On the other hand, we also know that they are, incurring heavy losses around Kyiv and Chernihiv. In this regard, maybe it's just, a nice way, a safe, a face-saving attempt of the Russians to say, okay, we are not making any progress, quite the opposite in Kyiv. Let's refocus, and we sell this as kind of our willingness to compromise. I'm not really sure if this is really happening. I mean, the bombing still continues. There's a very strong bombing of both cities. And even if the ground forces are relocated, the missiles and the shelling still inflicts heavy casualties among the Ukrainians in these two cities. And these can continue even without too many ground troops, of course.
Well, obviously, the biggest people who have suffered the most are the Ukrainian people who've been bombed relentlessly in places like you mentioned, and Kyiv in the north, as well as Mariupol in the south, which is besieged now by Russian troops, although it has not yet been taken. A lot of the focus, though, and you mentioned it, is on Putin himself. And you mentioned that you're not certain that Putin wants to end this anytime soon. He's going to throw a lot of resources at this. Two questions for you about that. One is, why will Putin, if this war is costing so much blood and also economically some very, very harsh sanctions against Russia, why is Putin continuing? That's part one. And then part two is, what do you think Putin is thinking about now with this war perhaps being a bit more of a stalemate than he might have previously thought?
Mhm. Well, first of all, like how bad are the sanctions? I've recently, going through some economic analysis, and it's actually not that bad. So the Russian GDP is supposed to shrink by about 10 to 15% this year. 10 to 15% is not that bad. Oil and gas is still flowing. Maybe not to the degree that it did before the war, but it is still flowing. The Europeans are totally dependent, especially my home country of Germany is completely dependent on oil, Russian gas and oil to some degree, more so than gas. So gas is more important to the Europeans for sure. So they're still making money. The ruble collapse has been halted. It's actually reversed. So economic sanctions are not really achieving, I think, what we want to see. At the same time, yes, it is still a very costly war for Putin, no doubt. And you rightly asked the question, why would he continue? But the reason is like if he now withdrew, it would look like a complete defeat. I mean, he has cornered himself where nothing less but demilitarization of Ukraine, neutrality of Ukraine, furthermore, the Ukrainian recognition of Crimea, and probably the two republics in the Donbas regions. And the Donbas region, we are not even really clear yet, how far they want to go. But I think these are the minimum requirements for Putin to actually say, okay, we are going to withdraw. But even the withdrawal seems to be somewhat optimistic that this is going to happen, because the point is that I think what Russia is trying to do here is creating another frozen conflict that they already did in Georgia, that they did in the Donbas region before this war since 2014. So Putin can continue what he's doing right now because he has the resources, and anything less than what I just mentioned would look like a defeat, which Putin, given his personality, is unwilling to take, but it also would weaken him politically quite a bit. He is the strongman of Russia. Like losing this war would undermine this myth that it has been built around him. So he needs to continue. There is no comfortable way out for him at this point.
I suppose, keeping that in consideration, you mentioned that the Russian people see him as this strongman. What is your perceived reaction from the Russian people? Is there, I know that it's been floated around perhaps that maybe the end of the war comes from within Russia, with people perhaps getting fed up with him. Do you think that's a likely scenario at this point?
Yeah, I fear not. I don't think that he will be toppled from below, like from the street. I mean, we have seen street protests are continuing, despite the fact that when people get arrested, they face up to 15 years in prison. So but they're small. There's really small demonstrations. We have seen very large demonstrations when Putin was re-elected president. After he had become prime minister. First he was president and prime minister, and then he got re-elected president. And there were large demonstrations all over Russia, and these demonstrations were essentially crashed. And I don't think that these demonstrations will lead too much. At the same time, actually, we see also a lot of pro-war people on the street, right? And of course, in the media, there are some hardliners that are even more hardliner than, let's say, the foreign minister, Lavrov. And so we have a kind of almost like pluralism in Russia. You should never use that word for Russia, but it's almost pluralism between those that do not want the war and that definitely do not even want to talk to Ukraine. And in between, we have somewhere Putin, Lavrov, and the military. If anything happens politically, it would have to come from inside the ruling regime. It might be coming from security agents. It might come from military officers. We do not know. We often, as political scientists, we are often in the dark when a coup happens, and then we are completely surprised. But we know that there is some opposition. Chubais recently resigned from his post and left. Russia in protest over this war. That is the highest ranking government official that has resigned, who has resigned. So there's hope, of course, but at this point, it's, I think, way too early to tell. The West needs to do more than it's currently doing. I mean, it is already pretty good, but more needs to be done. And I fear that we see some fatigue among the Western powers, especially in Europe, to further escalate the sanctions. So it might, Putin at this point can play for time. He has the time, he has the resources, and he's probably closely watching what's going on in Europe. And the waning resolve there. So that is why I think this war is going to continue. And this is why I think the West needs to do more to end this war more quickly, and maybe even be able to trigger political changes within Russia.
What do you think that the West could do? I'll admit, and maybe a lot of people watching this may have the same feeling. My understanding of this is that the West has had some fairly harsh sanctions, perhaps harsher than anticipated, against Putin. I guess the question to you, since you're saying that there more needs to be done, is there anything in particular? Would it be tanks being allowed in, planes being allowed into Ukraine? What could be done by the West to further amp up the pressure on Putin?
Yeah, in terms of military supplies, the Ukrainians definitely need more defensive weapons in terms of trying to get missiles down, get planes down. You don't necessarily need planes to get planes down. You can actually also use anti-aircraft missiles, which there are plenty, and so there's more military hardware that Ukraine needs, but Ukraine also needs, and what they have been demanding from the get-go, that we cut off the exports of oil and gas from Russia, and the European countries, including Germany, have been too reliant for decades now on Russian oil and gas. We should have diversified a long time ago. Now that we are thinking about a boycott in Germany, we actually need to make sure that we do that. It will hurt for sure, but Ukrainians are hurting more every day than us maybe having to turn down a little bit the heat in our flats, or drive 100 km/h on our autobahn instead of going having no speed limit. There are things that you can do, and the problem really is what I just said before. This war is now in its second month. People get a little bit tired of it. There are new issues coming up. A new variant of Omicron is, spreading. So, people do not have the eye on the ball anymore, and we can only hope for determined leadership to keep us engaged and and support Ukraine as much as we can.
Well, I suppose the broad question and the final one that I've got is, mentioned this when we first spoke back on February the 25th, but what in your mind is a month into this conflict, is the potential that this conflict spreads beyond Ukraine's borders, perhaps onto NATO-held land? And I guess the big worry in a lot of Americans' minds is, does this trigger a third world war or something along those lines?
Yeah, I understand the fears, and maybe like a couple of weeks ago, somewhat justified. I think that the risk has declined. Actually, I think it's less likely today that this is going to end up in a World War III with the use of nuclear weapons. The Russians seem to be relatively careful in not provoking NATO member states too much. Accidents can always happen, though. I have to say that is, a missile that flies a little bit too far towards the west and lands somewhere in Poland, kills Polish citizens. That would definitely be bad news. But that would be an accident. I don't think that Russia plans in any way to attack any of the NATO member countries, not even the Baltic countries, which were formerly part of the Soviet Union. That means Russian colonies. Even those will stay outside and will not be attacked by Russia.
I suppose a little relief there, but of course, all thoughts in this conflict, in particular with the Ukrainian people who, as you mentioned, have suffered so much and so greatly. But more importantly, Professor Stefes, we really appreciate a few minutes of your time and your lending us some of your expertise on this topic and answering, I think, a lot of questions on a lot of people's minds. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me again, Chris.
Thank you again, Professor Christophe Stefes, who joins us from the University of Colorado, Denver. Thank you again.
Thank you.